The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune as Marcus Rodriguez pushed his cleaning cart down the empty hallway of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology's Mathematics Department at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in October. The sound of squeaking wheels echoed against the polished floors, a rhythm he'd grown accustomed to over the past 3 years. But tonight felt different. Tonight, something in the air seemed to vibrate with possibility, though Marcus couldn't quite name what it was. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. As he approached room 2190, the Advanced Mathematical Theory classroom, he noticed the door was slightly ajar. Professor Elizabeth Chen must have forgotten to close it after her evening graduate seminar. Marcus had seen her hurrying out earlier with her arms full of papers, her phone pressed to her ear as she spoke rapidly in Mandarin. She always looked stressed during midterm season, but tonight she'd seemed particularly frazzled. Marcus paused at the doorway, his weathered hands gripping the handle of his mop. At 34, his face carried lines that spoke of sleepless nights and worry, but his dark eyes still held a spark that 3 years of custodial work and single parenthood hadn't managed to extinguish. Through the crack in the door, he could see the massive blackboard that dominated the front wall of the classroom. It was covered in Professor Chen's characteristic neat handwriting. Equations that seemed to dance and flow like poetry, written in a language most people couldn't understand. But Marcus could understand it. The realization hit him the same way it always did, like a secret he wasn't supposed to know, like a melody only he could hear in a crowded room. The symbols and numbers arranged themselves in his mind with perfect clarity, telling a story of mathematical relationships and theoretical possibilities that made his pulse quicken despite himself. He glanced down the hallway. Empty. The security guard wouldn't make his rounds for another hour, and the building was virtually deserted, except for a few graduate students holed up in the computer lab 3 floors down. Marcus made a decision that would change everything, though he had no way of knowing it yet. Pushing his cart inside, he flicked on the room's lights and closed the door behind him. The sudden brightness made him blink, but when his vision cleared, he found himself drawn to the blackboard like metal to a magnet. Professor Chen had been working on something complex, a proof related to harmonic analysis, specifically dealing with oscillatory integrals. The work was elegant but incomplete, stopping abruptly at a crucial step that had likely stumped even her brilliant graduate students. Marcus set down his cleaning supplies and walked closer to the board. His daughter, Isabella's backpack, the pink one with unicorn patches that she'd insisted on even though she was now 11 and supposedly too old for unicorns, hung from his shoulder. He'd picked her up from her after-school program at 6 p.m., helped her with homework at the kitchen table of their small apartment, made her favorite grilled cheese sandwich for dinner, and read her a chapter from the fantasy novel they'd been working through together. Then Mrs. Patterson from next door had come over to watch her while Marcus headed to his night shift. This was his routine, his life, his world. But here, standing in front of this blackboard covered in mathematical beauty, he felt like someone else entirely. Someone he used to be, someone he'd thought was lost forever. He pulled out his phone and snapped a photo of the board, then spent several minutes studying the work more closely. The problem was related to proving bounds for certain types of Fourier transforms, specifically trying to establish sharp estimates for oscillatory integrals with polynomial phase functions. It was graduate-level work, the kind of thing that would typically require a PhD in mathematics to even attempt. Marcus had never earned that PhD. He'd come close, so close he could still taste the possibility some nights when he lay awake, staring at the ceiling of his cramped bedroom. He'd been a promising graduate student at Boston University 8 years ago, working on his dissertation in harmonic analysis under the guidance of Professor Alan Whitmore. His research had been groundbreaking, exploring new connections between classical harmonic analysis and modern approaches to partial differential equations. But then Sofia had gotten pregnant. Beautiful, brilliant Sofia, who was working on her own PhD in literature while waitressing at the campus coffee shop where they'd met during Marcus's second year. They'd been careful, but life had other plans. Isabella had arrived during what should have been Marcus's final year of graduate school, and everything changed. At first, they'd thought they could manage it all. Sofia would finish her dissertation while Marcus completed his degree, and they'd somehow juggle parenthood with their academic pursuits. But Isabella had been born 6 weeks premature, requiring extended time in the NICU, and the medical bills had mounted faster than their graduate stipends could cover. Sofia's postpartum depression had been severe, requiring therapy and medication they couldn't afford. The stress had pulled them in different directions, and by the time Isabella turned 2, Sofia had made a choice that still echoed through Marcus's dreams. "I can't do this anymore," she'd said on a rainy Thursday morning, her suitcase already packed. "I love Isabella and I love you, but I'm drowning. I need to finish my degree. I need to become who I'm supposed to be." She'd moved to California to complete her dissertation at UC Berkeley, promising to stay in touch, to help with Isabella, to be the mother their daughter deserved. The promises had lasted about 6 months. Marcus had faced an impossible choice: continue his graduate work while caring for a toddler as a single parent, or find a way to make ends meet immediately. The decision had made itself. He'd taken a leave of absence that became permanent. Found work first as a teaching assistant at a community college, then as a tutor for high school students, and finally here at MIT as part of the custodial staff. The pay was steady, the benefits decent, and the hours worked with Isabella's schedule. But the mathematics had never left him. It lived in his mind like music he couldn't turn off, playing softly in the background of his daily life. When he cleaned the math department's classrooms, he couldn't help but read the work left on the boards. When he overheard professors discussing their research in the hallways, his mind automatically followed their reasoning. When Isabella asked for help with her homework, he had to consciously dial back his explanations to match her 6th grade level understanding. Now, standing in front of Professor Chen's unfinished proof, Marcus felt that old familiar pull. His mind began working through the problem, seeing pathways and connections that seemed obvious once he focused on them. He thought about the techniques he'd learned years ago, the papers he'd read, the insights that had once earned him recognition as one of the most promising young mathematicians in his program. Almost without conscious thought, he picked up a piece of chalk from the ledge beneath the blackboard. The feel of it between his fingers was like greeting an old friend. He began to write, slowly at first, then with growing confidence. His handwriting was different from Professor Chen's, larger, more angular, shaped by years of explaining concepts to students who were struggling to understand. But the mathematics was pure, elegant, beautiful. He worked for nearly an hour, lost in the flow of logical reasoning and creative problem-solving that had once been as natural to him as breathing. The solution unfolded in stages, each step building naturally on the previous one. He used a technique involving dyadic decomposition that he'd developed during his own graduate work, combined with some newer approaches he'd read about in papers he'd downloaded during his lunch breaks over the past few years. When he finally stepped back, the blackboard told a complete story. Professor Chen's original work had been extended and completed, the crucial missing steps filled in with careful reasoning and elegant mathematical argumentation. The proof was not only correct but innovative, using methods that weren't commonly applied to this type of problem. Marcus stared at what he'd written, a mixture of pride and panic washing over him. What had he done? This wasn't his classroom, his problem, his life anymore. He was Marcus Rodriguez, night custodian, single father, man who cleaned up after other people's brilliance rather than creating his own. He glanced at his watch, 1:23 a.m. He needed to finish his rounds and get home to Isabella, but he couldn't bring himself to erase what he'd written. Instead, he took several photos of the completed proof with his phone, then gathered his cleaning supplies and quietly left the room. As he continued his rounds through the building, cleaning offices and emptying trash cans, his mind kept returning to the mathematics he'd just completed. It felt like waking up after a long sleep, like remembering who he used to be. The rest of his shift passed in a blur of routine tasks and racing thoughts. By the time he walked out into the pre-dawn darkness, Marcus had convinced himself that tomorrow he would return to normal life. He would clean the board before Professor Chen arrived, erasing the evidence of his late-night mathematical adventure. No one would ever know that Marcus Rodriguez, Custodian, had solved a problem that had stumped graduate students and professors. But as he drove through the empty streets toward his apartment, where Isabella was sleeping safely under Mrs. Patterson's watchful eye, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. The mathematics was still there, still alive in his mind, and for the first time in years, he wondered what might happen if he stopped hiding from it. He thought about Isabella, about the promise he'd made to himself to give her a stable life, to be the parent she could count on. He thought about the dreams he'd abandoned and the reality he'd embraced. And he wondered, with a mixture of hope and fear that made his hands tremble on the steering wheel, whether it might be possible to have both. The morning would bring Professor Chen's discovery of the completed proof. And with it, questions that Marcus wasn't sure he was ready to answer. But tonight, driving through the quiet streets of Cambridge with his daughter's backpack beside him and the ghost of chalk dust still under his fingernails, Marcus Rodriguez allowed himself to remember what it felt like to be brilliant. The alarm buzzed at 6:30 a.m., pulling Marcus from dreams filled with mathematical equations and the sound of chalk on Blackboard. For a moment, he lay in bed trying to hold on to the feeling from the night before, that sense of being fully alive, fully himself. But reality crashed back as Isabella's voice called from the kitchen. "Dad, I can't find my science project." Marcus rolled out of bed, his back protesting from hours of mopping and the tension of hunching over that blackboard. Their apartment was small, 2 bedrooms in a building that had seen better decades, but it was home. Isabella had decorated her room with posters of planets and periodic tables, alongside the typical pre-teen collection of boy band photos and friendship bracelets. She was smart, scary smart, and sometimes Marcus caught her looking at him with an expression that reminded him painfully of Sofia. "It's on the counter next to the coffee maker," he called back, pulling on yesterday's jeans and a clean t-shirt. "The volcano model, right?" "Found it." "Thanks, Dad." Marcus smiled despite his exhaustion. Isabella's science project was a working volcano that demonstrated chemical reactions. She'd insisted on making it from scratch rather than using a kit, spending hours researching the best ratios of baking soda and vinegar to create the most dramatic eruption. Her teacher, Mrs. Henderson, had mentioned during the last parent conference that Isabella was performing well above grade level in mathematics and science. "She asks questions that make me think," Mrs. Henderson had said, her eyes twinkling. Yesterday, she wanted to know why we use base 10 math instead of base 12, and whether alien civilizations might have developed different mathematical systems. Not your typical 6th grade inquiry. Marcus had felt proud and terrified in equal measure. Isabella's curiosity was beautiful, but it also highlighted everything he wasn't giving her. A child with her potential deserved enrichment programs, specialized schools, opportunities that stretched far beyond what his custodial salary could provide. He found Isabella in the kitchen, carefully placing her volcano model in a cardboard box padded with dish towels. She was wearing her favorite outfit, purple leggings, a NASA t-shirt, and the sneakers that lit up when she walked. Her dark hair, so much like Sofia's, was pulled back in a ponytail that revealed the determined set of her jaw. "Dad, can you help me with something?" she asked without looking up from her careful packing. "Of course. What do you need?" "Well, Mrs. Henderson said we could do extra credit projects, and I want to research fractals. But I don't really understand how the math works." She paused, then looked at him with those serious dark eyes that always made his chest tighten. "I know you're good at math. Mom used to say you were brilliant at it." Marcus froze, a piece of toast halfway to his mouth. Isabella rarely mentioned Sofia directly, and when she did, it was usually in passing, as if testing whether the subject was safe to explore. They'd developed an unspoken agreement over the years. Sofia existed in their past, but they didn't dwell there. "Your mom said that?" he asked carefully. Isabella nodded, returning her attention to the volcano. "Before she left, I was little, but I remember some things. She said you could solve any math problem, that you saw patterns other people couldn't see." She shrugged with the practiced casualness of a child who'd learned to protect herself from disappointment. "I just thought maybe you could help me understand the fractal stuff." The toast turned to cardboard in Marcus's mouth. How could he explain that he'd spent the previous night solving graduate-level problems while she slept? How could he tell her that her mother had been right about his mathematical abilities, but that those abilities felt like a luxury he couldn't afford? "I can try to help," he said finally. "Maybe we can look at some basic fractal patterns this weekend. Start simple and work our way up." Isabella's face lit up with a smile that made all his sacrifices feel worthwhile. "Really, that would be amazing. Katie's dad is an engineer, and he helped her build a robot for her project. I thought maybe, since you're smart with math, you could help me do something cool too." The casual comparison to Katie's engineer father hit harder than Isabella had intended. Marcus knew she wasn't trying to make him feel inadequate, but the reminder of what he wasn't, what he couldn't provide, settled like a stone in his stomach. After getting Isabella off to school with her volcano and a lunch packed with more care than creativity, Marcus faced his own day. He had 6 hours before he needed to start his evening shift at MIT, which meant 6 hours to fill with the kind of work that paid by the hour and offered no benefits. Tuesdays and Thursdays, he tutored high school students in mathematics at a community center in Somerville. The pay was decent, $25 an hour, but the work was inconsistent. His first student was David Chen, a junior at Somerville High who was struggling with pre-calculus. Ironically, he was Professor Elizabeth Chen's nephew, though Marcus had only learned this connection recently. David was bright but lacked confidence, convinced that he was bad at math because he needed time to process concepts that came easily to other students. "I just don't get it," David said, staring at a problem involving logarithmic functions. "My aunt tries to help me sometimes, but she's on a different level, you know. When she explains something, it's like she's speaking a foreign language." Marcus pulled his chair closer to David's desk. This was the part of his day he actually enjoyed, taking complex mathematical concepts and finding ways to make them accessible, building bridges between confusion and understanding. "Let's try a different approach," Marcus said. "Instead of thinking about logarithms as these abstract mathematical objects, let's think about them as questions. Every logarithm is really just asking, what power do I need to raise this base to get that result?" He worked with David for an hour, watching the boy's face gradually brighten as the concepts began to make sense. By the end of their session, David was solving problems independently, his confidence growing with each correct answer. "You're really good at this," David said as they packed up. "Like you make it seem so obvious. My aunt is super smart, but you're good at explaining things." The compliment warmed Marcus, but it also reminded him of the conversation he'd overheard the week before. David's mother had been talking to another parent about her son's improvement in math, mentioning that his tutor was some guy who works as a janitor at MIT. The casual dismissal in her tone had stung, even though Marcus knew she hadn't meant it cruelly. After David left, Marcus had 3 hours to kill before his evening shift. He usually spent this time at the public library, using their free internet to read mathematical papers and journals. It was his guilty pleasure, his way of staying connected to the world he'd left behind. But today, the memory of the previous night's work made him restless. Instead of heading to the library, he drove to a small park near Isabella's school. It was too cold to sit on the benches, so he remained in his car, watching elementary school kids play on the swings while their parents or babysitters chatted nearby. The scene was peaceful, ordinary, everything he'd tried to build for Isabella. But his mind kept drifting back to that blackboard, to the feeling of chalk in his fingers and mathematics flowing from his brain to the surface with perfect clarity. He pulled out his phone and looked at the photos he'd taken of his completed proof. Even in the harsh fluorescent lighting of the phone's camera, the work looked elegant, sophisticated, worthy of publication in a respected journal. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine what might have been. If Sofia hadn't gotten pregnant, if Isabella hadn't been born premature, if the medical bills hadn't forced impossible choices, where would he be now? Probably finishing a postdoc at a prestigious university, maybe already working toward tenure, publishing papers, attending conferences, contributing to humanity's understanding of mathematical truth. But then he thought about Isabella's smile that morning, about the way she trusted him to help her understand fractals, about the life they'd built together in their small apartment with its creaky floors and thin walls. Would he trade any of that for the career he'd lost? The question felt impossible to answer. His phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Patterson. Isabella got home safely. She's working on homework and wants to wait until you get back to eat dinner. Such a good girl. Marcus smiled and started the car. He had just enough time to grab coffee and a sandwich before heading to MIT for another night of cleaning up after other people's brilliance. As he drove through the afternoon traffic, he made a mental note to stop by the mathematics library on his break. There were some new papers on harmonic analysis he'd been meaning to read, and maybe he could find some simple resources about fractals to share with Isabella over the weekend. It was a compromise that felt familiar, staying connected to mathematics without fully embracing it, living on the edges of the world he'd once thought would be his home. But as he pulled into MIT's parking lot and saw the familiar buildings where some of the world's greatest minds pushed the boundaries of human knowledge, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting. Tonight, he would return to Professor Chen's classroom. He would see if his proof was still on the blackboard, or if it had been erased like a dream upon waking. Either way, he knew he would remember what it felt like to be brilliant, even if only for one night. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the campus as Marcus walked toward the mathematics building, his custodial uniform clean and pressed, his mind already anticipating the quiet hours ahead when he would clean the spaces where genius dwelt. He was Marcus Rodriguez, single father, dedicated employee, man who had learned to find satisfaction in the small victories of daily life. But he was also the person who had solved Professor Elizabeth Chen's proof the night before, and that person was still very much alive. Marcus's hands were shaking as he approached room 2190 at 11:15 p.m. The hallway seemed longer tonight, each step echoing with the weight of possibility and dread. Would his proof still be on the blackboard? Had Professor Chen seen it? Had she erased it without a second thought, assuming some graduate student had been working late? The door was closed this time, locked according to the evening schedule. Marcus used his master key, his heart hammering as he pushed the door open and flicked on the lights. The blackboard was exactly as he'd left it, but now there were additions. In red chalk, Professor Chen's signature color, someone had written notes in the margins. Not corrections, but extensions, building on his work, taking his proof and pushing it further into territory that made Marcus's pulse quicken with recognition and excitement. At the bottom of the board, in Professor Chen's neat handwriting, was a simple question in English and Chinese characters. Who solved this? Please see me. Ikud Chen. Marcus stared at the words until they seemed to blur together. She wanted to know who had completed her proof. She was impressed enough to build on the work, to ask questions, to invite collaboration. For a moment he felt a surge of pure joy. His mathematics had been seen, understood, valued by someone who could appreciate its elegance. Then reality crashed back. He was Marcus Rodriguez, night custodian. He had no business solving Professor Chen's problems. He had no credentials, no academic affiliation, no right to be in this conversation. And he had Isabella to think about. A job to protect, a life carefully constructed around the need for stability and security. He should erase the board, return to his cleaning routine, pretend this had never happened. Instead, he found himself picking up the white chalk and writing a response below Professor Chen's question. Just someone who loves mathematics. Thank you for the beautiful work. Then he forced himself to walk away, to complete his rounds, to return to being invisible. But the universe, who it seemed had other plans, the next evening, Marcus arrived for his shift to find a small crowd gathered outside room 2190. Through the open door, he could see Professor Chen standing at the blackboard with 3 graduate students, all of them gesturing excitedly at the mathematical work displayed there. Her response to his note had been expansive. She'd filled 2 additional boards with related theorems and proofs, creating what looked like a comprehensive exploration of the harmonic analysis problem they'd been tackling together. The technique used here is absolutely inspired, he heard one of the graduate students saying as he pushed his cart past the doorway. I've never seen dyadic decomposition applied to oscillatory integrals in quite this way. It's almost like the person was thinking about the problem from a completely different angle. That's exactly what caught my attention, Professor Chen replied. The approach is sophisticated but not standard. Whoever wrote this has deep knowledge but also creative insight. They're seeing connections that aren't obvious. Marcus kept walking, but their words followed him down the hallway. Creative insight, deep knowledge, seeing connections. This was the language of his old world, the vocabulary of mathematical recognition that he hadn't heard applied to his own work in years. Over the next week, the Blackboard conversation continued. Each night, Marcus would find new additions from Professor Chen and her students. They were exploring the implications of his original proof, finding applications to other problems, building what was becoming a significant contribution to the field. And each night, Marcus found himself unable to resist adding his own thoughts, clarifications, alternative approaches, extensions to even more general cases. The anonymous mathematical collaboration became the talk of the department. Marcus overheard professors in the hallway speculating about the mysterious contributor. Some thought it was a visiting researcher who preferred to work at night. Others suggested it might be a faculty member from another department. A few wondered if it could be an exceptionally talented graduate student, whoever it is. They're going to revolutionize how we approach this class of problems, Professor Chen told her colleague. Dr. Michael Torres, as Marcus emptied the trash can outside her office. The work is already beyond what I typically see from postdoc candidates. If I could identify this person, I'd want to collaborate with them immediately. Dr. Torres, a specialist in algebraic topology, laughed. Maybe it's the ghost of Ramanujan, working through the night when no one's watching. The reference made Marcus smile, despite his growing anxiety. Srinivasa Ramanujan, the self-taught Indian mathematician who had amazed the academic world with his intuitive brilliance despite lacking formal training. But Ramanujan had eventually been recognized, brought to Cambridge, given the platform his genius deserved. Marcus couldn't see any such future for himself. The situation reached a turning point on Friday evening when Marcus arrived for his shift to find a security camera being installed outside room 290, just a precaution. Dr. Sarah Kim, the department chair, was explaining to the technician. We've had someone accessing the classroom after hours. Probably harmless, but we need to know who has keys to our spaces. Marcus felt his world tilt. The camera wouldn't just catch him entering the room. It would record him writing on the blackboard, revealing his identity to the very people who had been praising his anonymous work. His secret would be exposed, his careful balance between his 2 lives destroyed. That night, he couldn't bring himself to go near room 2190. He completed his other duties mechanically, his mind racing through possible scenarios. Should he quit his job before being discovered? Should he try to explain himself to Dr. Kim? Should he simply stop contributing to the Blackboard collaboration and hope the whole thing would be forgotten? Instead, he found himself in the mathematics library at 2 a.m., sitting among the stacks with a journal article about recent advances in harmonic analysis. The familiar ritual of reading mathematical papers usually calmed him, but tonight every equation seemed to mock his situation. Here was the world he longed to be part of, the conversations he wanted to join, the recognition he craved, all of it just out of reach because of choices he'd made and circumstances he couldn't change. He was so absorbed in his reading that he didn't notice the footsteps until someone cleared their throat. "Behind him, I thought I might find you here." Marcus spun around to see Professor Chen standing in the library entrance, wearing jeans and a MIT sweatshirt, her hair pulled back in a ponytail. She looked younger than she did during her lectures, more approachable, but her eyes held the same sharp intelligence that had made her one of the most respected mathematicians in her field. "Professor Chen," Marcus stammered, closing the journal and starting to stand. I work here, cleaning, and I sometimes—" "Sit down, please," she said, taking the chair across from him. "I've been watching the library security footage from this week. You come here often, don't you? After your shift ends?" Marcus nodded, unable to speak. Was this how it ended? A conversation in the library at 2 a.m. with the professor whose work he'd been anonymously completing. Professor Chen leaned forward, her expression serious but not unkind. "I also reviewed the footage from outside room 2190. I know you've been the one writing on my blackboard." The words hung in the air between them, like a mathematical equation waiting to be solved. Marcus felt simultaneously exposed and relieved. The secret that had been eating at him was finally out in the open. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I know I shouldn't have. It's not my place to—" "Stop," Professor Chen interrupted. "You're apologizing for some of the most elegant mathematical work I've seen in years, for solutions that my graduate students and I have been struggling with for months." She pulled out her phone and showed him photos of the Blackboard from that evening. The mathematical conversation had grown to cover all 4 walls of the classroom, a comprehensive exploration of harmonic analysis techniques that represented weeks of collaborative thinking. "This work," she said, pointing to sections Marcus recognized as his contributions, "is publishable. More than publishable, it's groundbreaking. The approach to oscillatory integrals you developed could reshape how we think about entire classes of problems." Marcus stared at the photos, seeing his own mathematical thinking displayed with the same respect Professor Chen would give to any colleague's work. For a moment, he allowed himself to feel proud of what he'd accomplished. "But I don't understand," Professor Chen continued. "Your employee file says you have some college background, but no advanced degrees. How do you know this material? Where did you learn these techniques?" The question Marcus had been dreading. How could he explain 8 years of abandoned dreams, of mathematical genius put on hold for dirty diapers and midnight feedings? How could he make her understand the choice between pursuing brilliance and being a responsible father? "I was a graduate student," he said finally. "At BU, I was working on my PhD in mathematics, specializing in harmonic analysis. But things changed. I had to stop before I finished." Professor Chen studied his face with the same intensity she brought to mathematical problems. "What happened?" "My daughter was born. Her mother left. I needed a job that could support us both, something stable with benefits. Academia felt like a luxury I couldn't afford." The words sounded simple, but Marcus could see that Professor Chen understood the complexity behind them. She nodded slowly, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer. "How old is your daughter now?" 11. She's brilliant, wants to study fractals for a science project. She's going to be everything I couldn't be. And what about what you could still be? The question hit Marcus like a physical blow. Could still be, as if his mathematical life wasn't over, as if the choice he'd made 8 years ago wasn't final, as if there might still be pathways forward he hadn't considered. "I don't know," he admitted. "I've been away from academia for so long. I don't have the connections, the credentials, the time. I have responsibilities." Professor Chen was quiet for a long moment, and Marcus could almost see her mind working through the problem he presented. Not mathematical this time, but human. When she finally spoke, her words changed everything. "What if I told you there might be a way to have both? To be the father Isabella needs, and the mathematician you were meant to be?" Marcus felt his heart stop. "What do you mean?" "I mean that work you've been doing on my Blackboard represents months of research. It's the foundation for papers that could be published in the most prestigious journals. It's the kind of thinking that earns PhD degrees and postdoctoral positions." She paused, then smiled. "It's also the kind of work that wins research grants." The implications of what she was suggesting began to dawn on Marcus. Research grants meant funding. Funding meant he wouldn't have to choose between financial stability and mathematical pursuit. It meant he could provide for Isabella while also returning to the world of ideas that had shaped who he was meant to be. "I can't promise anything," Professor Chen continued, "but I'd like to try something. I'd like to propose that you join my research group as a collaborator. Officially, we'd work together to formalize the results you've been developing, submit them for publication, apply for grants to support continued research. You could finish your PhD part-time while working with us." Marcus stared at her, unable to process what he was hearing. After 8 years of cleaning other people's blackboards, someone was offering to write his name on one, as a colleague, as a mathematician, as someone whose ideas mattered. "Why?" he asked. "Why would you take this risk?" "I'm nobody. I'm a custodian with an unfinished degree and a complicated life," Professor Chen smiled. And for the first time since their conversation began, she looked completely certain of her answer. Because mathematics doesn't care about your job title or your circumstances. It only cares about truth, beauty, and insight. And you, Marcus Rodriguez, have all three in abundance. As they walked out of the library together into the early morning darkness, Marcus felt something shift inside him. The careful boundaries he'd built between his two lives, the custodian and the mathematician, were beginning to blur. And for the first time in 8 years, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to be both. But first, he had to figure out how to tell Isabella that her father's life was about to change in ways neither of them had ever imagined. The hardest conversation of Marcus's life happened. Over Saturday morning pancakes, Isabella sat across from him at their small kitchen table, drowning her stack of pancakes in syrup while chattering about her upcoming science fair presentation. She'd spent the previous evening working on her fractal research with Marcus's help, and her excitement was infectious. But Marcus could barely concentrate on her words. His mind was spinning with the implications of Professor Chen's offer and the decision he knew he had to make. "Dad, you're being weird," Isabella said, pausing mid-bite to study his face. "You look like you did that time you tried to assemble my bike and couldn't figure out the instructions." Marcus laughed, despite his anxiety. Isabella had always been perceptive, able to read his moods with an accuracy that sometimes unsettled him. There was no point in trying to hide that something significant was happening. "Bella," he said, setting down his coffee mug, "what would you think if Dad went back to school?" Isabella's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. "Like college?" "You already went to college. I mean graduate school. To finish something I started before you were born. To get a PhD in mathematics." The words felt strange in his mouth after so many years of not saying them. Isabella was quiet for a moment, her dark eyes serious as she considered this new information. "Is that why you're so good at math? Because you were studying it in college?" "Yes, I was working on becoming a professor, like the people I work with now at MIT, but then you came along, and I decided being your dad was more important than finishing school." Isabella set down her fork completely. "You stopped because of me?" Marcus heard the worry in her voice and quickly moved to the chair next to hers, pulling her into a side hug. "Not stopped because of you, sweetheart. I made a choice to focus on being your father because that was what felt most important at the time. And I've never regretted it, not for a single day. But now you want to go back? Maybe, if we could find a way to make it work. If I could do both, be your dad and also be a mathematician, would that be okay with you? Isabella leaned against his shoulder, and Marcus could feel her thinking through the implications. She was 11, but she understood more about their financial situation than he sometimes wished she did. She knew they lived carefully, that extra expenses required planning, that her father worked nights so he could be available for her after school. Would we have more money? She asked finally. The practical question made Marcus smile. Eventually, yes. It might be tight at first while I'm going to school, but if I finish my degree, I could get a better job. I could become a professor myself, or work at a research lab, or maybe even teach at a university. Isabella was quiet for another long moment. Then she surprised him with a question that cut straight to the heart of his fears. Is this because of what I said about Katie's dad being an engineer? Because I didn't mean to make you feel bad. Marcus's chest tightened. His daughter was too perceptive, too sensitive to the subtle ways his own insecurities leaked into their conversations. No, sweetheart. This isn't about Katie's dad or anyone else. This is about something I've been thinking about for a long time. Okay, Isabella said, but Marcus could hear the uncertainty in her voice. If you want to go back to school, I think you should. You love math. I can tell when you help me with homework. You get this look on your face, like you're solving a really fun puzzle. The simplicity of her acceptance made Marcus's eyes water. Here he was, agonizing over a decision that could reshape their entire lives. And his 11-year-old daughter was offering her support with the same matter-of-fact generosity she brought to everything else. There's something else, Marcus said. Remember how I told you I cleaned the classrooms at MIT? Well, I've been helping solve some math problems there, and one of the professors wants to work with me officially. Her name is Professor Chen. Isabella's eyes widened. Like David's aunt, the one who's super smart? Marcus nodded, realizing he'd never mentioned the connection before. Yes, exactly like David's aunt. She thinks I could help her with research, and she wants to help me finish my degree. That's so cool. Isabella's excitement was genuine, and Marcus felt some of his anxiety ease. So you'd be like a real mathematician? I hope so. But it would mean some changes. I might have to work different hours, spend time in classes and studying. We'd have to figure out new routines. Isabella nodded seriously, already problem-solving in the way that reminded Marcus so much of himself. Mrs. Patterson could watch me more often. And I'm old enough to be alone for a little while after school. Plus, if you're at MIT during the day sometimes, maybe I could visit and see where you work. The eagerness in her voice made Marcus realize that his daughter might be even more excited about this possibility than he was. She'd grown up with a father who downplayed his intelligence, who worked a job that didn't reflect his capabilities, who helped her with homework while carefully hiding the depth of his own knowledge. The chance to see him recognized for his abilities, to watch him pursue something he was passionate about, might be as meaningful for her as it was for him. Monday morning found Marcus in Professor Chen's office at 9 a.m., having arranged to use vacation time from his custodial job. The office was everything he'd expected. Walls lined with mathematical texts, whiteboards covered in equations, stacks of papers representing ongoing research projects. But Professor Chen herself was more relaxed than he'd expected, wearing jeans and a cardigan, her feet tucked under her in an office chair that had clearly seen years of use. I've been thinking about our conversation, she said without preamble, and I've talked to some colleagues about the situation. I think there's a path forward, but it's going to require some creativity. She pulled out a folder and spread several documents across her desk. First, the research grant situation. The work you've been doing on harmonic analysis is substantial enough to support a National Science Foundation proposal. If we can get funding, and I think we can, Given the quality of your contributions, that would provide a stipend for you to work as a research assistant while completing your degree. Marcus stared at the grant application forms, his mind racing. NSF funding was competitive, prestigious, the kind of support that could transform not just his career prospects, but his entire life. The timeline would be challenging, Professor Chen continued. You'd need to re-enroll in a PhD program. I've spoken to contacts at BU about your situation, and they're willing to consider readmitting you with advanced standing based on your previous work. You'd essentially be picking up where you left off, but with a research project already in progress. What about my current job? Marcus asked. I can't just quit without notice. I have bills, responsibilities. That's where it gets creative, Professor Chen smiled. MIT has a work-study program for graduate students. You could transition from custodial work to a research assistantship here, maintaining your benefits while shifting your role. The pay would actually be slightly better, and the hours would be more compatible with classes. Marcus felt dizzy with possibility. Every practical concern he'd raised was being addressed with solutions he'd never imagined existed. But one worry remained paramount. What about Isabella? My schedule now works around her school hours. If I'm taking classes, doing research, writing a dissertation, you'd have more flexibility, not less, Professor Chen assured him. Graduate students set their own schedules to a large extent. Research work can be done evenings and weekends when convenient. And she paused as if unsure whether to continue. And what? MIT has excellent programs for faculty and graduate student families, childcare, summer programs, even opportunities for bright kids like Isabella to participate in educational activities here on campus. Your daughter wouldn't be a burden on your academic career. She'd be welcomed as part of the community. The conversation continued for over an hour, with Professor Chen outlining a detailed plan that seemed almost too good to be true. She'd already spoken to her department chair about Marcus's situation. The grant proposal could be submitted within weeks, with a decision expected in 3 months. If funded, Marcus could begin transitioning his role immediately, start taking classes in the spring semester, and potentially complete his PhD within 3 years. Why are you doing this? Marcus asked as they wrapped up. You barely know me. You're taking enormous professional risks to help someone who might not work out. Professor Chen leaned back in her chair, considering her answer. Do you know how I got into mathematics? Marcus shook his head. My parents owned a restaurant in San Francisco's Chinatown. I spent my childhood doing homework at a corner table while they worked 16-hour days to keep the business afloat. I was good at math, but I didn't know that was unusual until a teacher in high school noticed and started giving me extra problems to solve. She pulled out a framed photo from her desk drawer, a young version of herself, standing with an elderly white woman in front of a classroom. Blackboard, Mrs. Rodriguez, no relation to you, despite the name, changed my life. She saw potential I didn't even know I had and fought to get me into programs I couldn't afford. She wrote recommendation letters, helped me apply for scholarships, even drove me to college interviews when my parents couldn't leave the restaurant. Marcus studied the photo, seeing in the young Elizabeth Chen's face the same mixture of hope and uncertainty he felt about his own situation. Mrs. Rodriguez died when I was finishing my PhD, Professor Chen continued. I never got to thank her properly, never got to show her how far her faith in me had carried me. When I see mathematical talent being wasted because of circumstances rather than ability, I think about her. I think about the responsibility we all have to recognize brilliance wherever we find it. She tucked the photo back in the drawer and looked directly at Marcus. Your work speaks for itself. Your situation is complicated, but it's not insurmountable. And your daughter deserves to see her father pursue his dreams just as much as you deserve to achieve them. That afternoon, Marcus found himself in an unlikely place, the MIT admissions office. filling out paperwork to audit a graduate course in real analysis. Professor Chen had arranged for him to sit in on lectures while his formal re-enrollment at BU was being processed. It felt surreal to be a student again after 8 years. To be surrounded by 20-somethings discussing problem sets and qualifying exams. But the mathematics felt like coming home. The first class he attended was a seminar on advanced harmonic analysis, the very field he'd been working in, anonymously for weeks. When Professor Chen introduced him to the group as a collaborator who's been contributing to our research on oscillatory integrals, Marcus felt a mixture of pride and terror. These graduate students knew his work, had been building on his ideas, had no idea that the person they'd been calling brilliant and innovative was sitting among them. After class, several students approached him with questions about the techniques he'd developed. Marcus found himself explaining mathematical concepts with an ease that surprised him, drawing diagrams on napkins in the student lounge while discussing applications to partial differential equations. "You should definitely publish this work," said Sarah Kim, no relation to the department chair, a third-year PhD student who'd been struggling with a related problem. "Have you thought about submitting to the Journal of Functional Analysis?" The idea of seeing his name in print, of contributing to the permanent record of mathematical knowledge, made Marcus's pulse quicken. For 8 years, his intellectual contributions had been limited to helping high school students understand algebra. Now he was discussing publication in journals he'd once only dreamed of reading as an author. But the real test came that evening when he returned home to Isabella. "How was your first day of being a mathematician again?" she asked, looking up from her homework. "Terrifying and amazing," Marcus admitted. "I keep waiting for someone to realize I don't belong there." Isabella set down her pencil and gave him a look that was remarkably mature for her 11 years. "Dad, you've been belonging there this whole time. You just weren't letting yourself see it." Her simple wisdom hit him with more force than all of Professor Chen's encouragement combined. His daughter had watched him hide his capabilities for years, had seen him diminish himself to fit a role that paid the bills but didn't feed his soul. Now she was watching him reclaim the parts of himself he'd thought were lost forever. "Are you proud of me?" he asked, the question slipping out before he could stop it. "I've always been proud of you," Isabella said matter-of-factly. "But now I'm proud that you're being proud of yourself too." That night, after Isabella had gone to bed, Marcus sat at his kitchen table with a laptop borrowed from the MIT library and began writing. Not cleaning schedules or grocery lists, but mathematical proofs. Formal versions of the work he'd been doing on Blackboards, prepared for submission to peer-reviewed journals. As he typed, he felt years of careful compromise and calculated diminishment falling away. He was Marcus Rodriguez, mathematician. He was Isabella's father, but he was also a scholar, a researcher, someone whose ideas could change how people understood the world. The next morning brought an email that changed everything permanently. The subject line read, "Grant proposal accepted, congratulations." Professor Chen had submitted a preliminary proposal based on their collaborative work, and the NSF had offered expedited review based on the strength of their mathematical contributions. The grant would provide full funding for Marcus to complete his PhD while working as a research assistant. With additional support for Isabella's educational needs, Marcus stared at the email until the words blurred together. 8 years of compromise were ending. A new chapter was beginning, and for the first time since Isabella was born, he could envision a future where being the father she deserved and the mathematician he was meant to be weren't competing dreams, but complementary parts of the same beautiful equation. He called Isabella into the kitchen and showed her the email. "Does this mean you're really going to be a professor?" she asked. "It means I'm going to try," Marcus said. "And no matter what happens, we're going to do it together." Isabella hugged him with the fierce strength of someone who'd watched her father doubt himself for too long and was thrilled to see him finally believing in his own brilliance. "I can't wait to tell Katie that my dad is going to be Dr. Rodriguez," she said into his shoulder. And for the first time in 8 years, Marcus could imagine himself worthy of that title. 3 months later, Marcus Rodriguez walked across the MIT campus on a crisp January morning, carrying a leather briefcase that had belonged to his father. Inside were the final drafts of 3 mathematical papers, each representing months of work that had transformed from anonymous Blackboard scribbles into rigorous academic contributions. The papers had been accepted for publication in prestigious journals, and Marcus's name would appear as lead author on research that was already being cited by mathematicians around the world. But the briefcase also contained something even more significant: the formal documentation of his readmission to Boston University's PhD program, with advanced standing that would allow him to complete his degree in 18 months, rather than starting over from the beginning. The transition hadn't been seamless. The first few weeks of juggling graduate coursework, research responsibilities, and single parenthood had pushed Marcus to his limits. There were nights when he questioned whether he'd made the right choice. Moments when the stress of his new life made the simplicity of his custodial routine seem appealing by comparison. But those doubts had faded as he settled into rhythms that felt more sustainable. His research assistantship at MIT provided enough income to cover their expenses while offering the flexibility he needed for Isabella's schedule. More importantly, the work itself energized him in ways he'd forgotten were possible. Each mathematical problem solved, each theorem proved, each insight shared with colleagues felt like reclaiming pieces of himself he'd thought were permanently lost. The real transformation, though, had been in his relationship with Isabella. She'd become his unofficial research assistant, helping him organize papers and prepare presentations while doing her own homework at the desk they now shared in their apartment's second bedroom, which had been converted into a study. Isabella took pride in understanding the basic concepts behind her father's work, asking questions that sometimes led Marcus to new insights. "Dad, why do you always draw those wavy lines when you're thinking about the oscillation problems?" she'd asked one evening while working on her own math homework. "Because the mathematical functions I study behave like waves," Marcus had explained. "They go up and down in patterns, and I'm trying to understand how those patterns work, like the patterns in my fractal project." Exactly like that. Mathematics is all about finding patterns, whether they're in waves or fractals or anything else. Isabella had nodded thoughtfully, then returned to her algebra problems with renewed focus. Later that evening, her casual observation about wave patterns had inspired Marcus to approach a particularly stubborn proof from a new angle, leading to a breakthrough that would become part of his second published paper. Their conversations about mathematics had deepened Isabella's own interest in the subject. Her science fair project on fractals had won first place at the regional competition, earning her an invitation to participate in MIT's summer program for gifted young students. The opportunity thrilled her almost as much as it terrified Marcus, who found himself in the strange position of worrying that his daughter might be too brilliant for her own good. "She has your mind," Professor Chen observed during one of their weekly research meetings. "The same ability to see patterns and connections that others miss. You should be proud." Marcus was proud, but he was also protective. He'd spent years trying to shield Isabella from the disappointment that could come with academic ambition. Now he was watching her embrace exactly the path that had once broken his heart. "What if she ends up like me?" he asked Professor Chen. "What if she has to choose between her dreams and other responsibilities?" "Then she'll make the choice that feels right at the time," Professor Chen replied. "And maybe if she's lucky, she'll find a way to circle back to those dreams when the time is right. Like you did." The spring semester brought new challenges and unexpected opportunities. Marcus's mathematical work had attracted attention beyond MIT and BU. He received invitations to present his research at conferences, to collaborate with mathematicians at other universities, to review papers for journals he'd once only dreamed of reading. The most significant invitation came from Dr. Alan Whitmore, Marcus's former advisor at Boston. University. Dr. Whitmore had followed Marcus's recent publications with interest and wanted to discuss the possibility of Marcus returning to complete his PhD under his original supervision. "I always regretted losing you," Dr. Whitmore said during their meeting in his office overlooking the Charles River. "You were one of the most promising students I'd worked with. When you left, I understood the circumstances, but I always hoped you'd find a way back." The conversation led to an arrangement that felt like vindication of every choice Marcus had made. He would complete his dissertation using the research he'd already developed with Professor Chen, while officially enrolled at BU under Dr. Whitmore's supervision. The work would satisfy all requirements for his PhD, and he'd be able to graduate in just over a year. "There's something else," Dr. Whitmore said as their meeting concluded. "We've been looking for someone to join our faculty as a lecturer in applied mathematics. The position would be perfect for someone with your background and research interests. Would you be interested in discussing it once you complete your degree?" Marcus left the meeting feeling like he was living someone else's life. A year ago, he'd been emptying trash cans and mopping floors. Now he was being offered a faculty position at a major research university. The transformation felt too dramatic to be real, but every day brought new evidence that his mathematical resurrection was genuine and permanent. The summer brought both triumph and challenge. Isabella's participation in MIT's youth program exceeded every expectation. She thrived among other gifted children, finally finding peers who shared her curiosity about complex mathematical concepts. But her success also highlighted how much Marcus's own journey was changing their family dynamic. "Sometimes I feel like I don't know how to talk to her anymore," Marcus confessed to Professor Chen during one of their research sessions. "She's becoming this brilliant young mathematician, and I'm proud of her, but I also miss when she was just my little girl who needed help with basic homework." "She's still your little girl," Professor Chen assured him. "She's just also becoming someone who can appreciate the work you do, who can understand why mathematics matters to you. That's a gift, not a loss." The gift became apparent during Marcus's first major conference presentation. He'd been invited to speak at the International Congress of Mathematicians about his work on oscillatory integrals. It was the kind of opportunity that established careers, the sort of recognition that Marcus had dreamed about during his graduate school years. Isabella insisted on attending. "I want to see you be famous," she said, with the directness that always made Marcus smile. "I'm not going to be famous, sweetheart. I'm just going to give a talk about mathematics to other mathematicians." "Same thing," Isabella replied confidently. The presentation went better than Marcus had dared hope. His work was received with enthusiasm by an audience that included some of the world's leading experts in harmonic analysis. During the question period, several prominent mathematicians praised the elegance of his approach and suggested applications he hadn't considered. But the moment that mattered most came afterward, when Isabella ran up to him in the conference hallway. "Dad, that was amazing. I understood about half of what you said, and the half I understood was so cool." Looking at his daughter's excited face, surrounded by colleagues who were congratulating him on his presentation, Marcus felt a completeness he'd never imagined possible. He was Dr. Marcus Rodriguez, mathematician, researcher, contributor to human knowledge. He was also Isabella's father, homework helper, pancake maker, bedtime story reader. For the first time in his adult life, those identities felt not just compatible, but complementary. The fall brought Marcus's dissertation defense, a formality given the strength of his published research, but emotionally significant as the official end of his 8-year detour from academic life. Isabella attended the defense sitting in the back row of the conference room, while Marcus presented his work to the examining committee. When Dr. Whitmore announced that Marcus had passed with distinction and would be awarded his PhD in December, Isabella's cheer was audible throughout the room. The examining committee smiled at her enthusiasm, and several professors commented afterward on how refreshing it was to see a graduate student's family so invested in their academic success. "Most of our students' families don't really understand what we do," Dr. Whitmore observed. "Your daughter clearly appreciates the significance of your work." "She's been my motivation through all of this," Marcus replied. "I wanted her to see that dreams don't have to be permanent sacrifices, that sometimes they can be temporarily set aside and then reclaimed when the time is right." The job offer from Boston University was formalized 2 weeks later. Marcus would join the faculty as an assistant professor of mathematics with a research focus on harmonic analysis and a teaching load that would include both undergraduate and graduate courses. The salary was more than double what he'd earned as a custodian, and the position came with funding for continued research, sabbatical opportunities, and full benefits for his family. Isabella's reaction to the news was characteristically practical. "Does this mean I can stop worrying about whether we have enough money for my college fund?" she asked. Marcus laughed and pulled her into a hug. "Yes, sweetheart. This means we're going to be okay. Better than okay." "Good," Isabella said, "because I've been thinking about studying mathematics too, and I want to go to a really good school." The comment made Marcus's heart skip. His daughter was following in his footsteps, but she was doing so from a position of strength and support rather than compromise and sacrifice. She would never have to choose between her intellectual ambitions and her personal responsibilities the way he had. She would grow up knowing that brilliance was something to be celebrated, not hidden. Christmas Eve found Marcus and Isabella in his new office at Boston University, which was still in the process of being furnished and organized. They were hanging mathematical prints on the walls and arranging books on shelves while snow fell outside the windows overlooking the campus where Marcus had once been a struggling graduate student. "Read me the nameplate again," Isabella requested, pointing to the brass plaque that would soon be mounted outside his door. "Dr. Marcus Rodriguez, Assistant Professor of Mathematics," Marcus read aloud, still amazed by how natural the words sounded. "I like how it sounds," Isabella said. "Dr. Rodriguez, my dad, the professor." That evening, as they decorated their small Christmas tree in their apartment that no longer felt cramped but cozy, Marcus reflected on the year that had transformed everything. 12 months ago, he'd been a custodian with secret mathematical abilities. Tonight, he was a professor with a published research record and a daughter who shared his passion for mathematical beauty. The tree was topped with a star that Isabella had made in art class, a 5-pointed silver star covered in glitter that caught the light from every angle. As Marcus plugged in the lights, he thought about how different this Christmas felt from all the previous ones since Sofia had left. For the first time in years, he felt like their life was moving forward rather than simply continuing. "Dad," Isabella said as they admired their decorated tree, "I have a question about your math work." "Sure. What do you want to know?" "You know how you study waves and patterns and how they behave." "Yes." "Well, I've been thinking about our family like a mathematical pattern. Mom leaving was like a disruption, and for a long time we were trying to find a new, stable pattern. But now, with you being a professor and me understanding more about what you do, it feels like we found a really good pattern, like we're oscillating in a way that makes sense." Marcus stared at his 11-year-old daughter, amazed once again by her ability to find mathematical metaphors for human experience. She was right. Their family had found a new equilibrium, a stable pattern that incorporated both his professional ambitions and their personal bond. "That's a beautiful way to think about it," he said. "We're like a mathematical system that's found its optimal solution." Isabella grinned. "Exactly. And the best part is, I think our pattern is going to keep getting more interesting as we both keep learning new things." as they sat together on their couch, watching the lights twinkle on their tree while snow continued to fall outside. Marcus felt a profound sense of gratitude. He'd spent years believing that he had to choose between being a good father and being a mathematician. Now he understood that the choice had been false from the beginning. The best version of himself, the version Isabella deserved as a father, included all of his capabilities, not just the ones that felt safe or practical. His phone buzzed with a text from Professor Chen. "Saw the announcement about your BU appointment in the department newsletter. Congratulations on completing your journey back to where you belong. Your Blackboard work has become the foundation for an entire research program. Mathematics is lucky to have you back." Marcus showed the message to Isabella, who read it with the serious expression she always wore when processing important information. "She's right," Isabella said finally. "Mathematics is lucky to have you. But I'm the luckiest because I get to be your daughter and your research assistant." "Research assistant?" Marcus asked with amusement. "Well, who else is going to help you organize your papers and ask the questions that lead to new insights?" "I take my job very seriously." As midnight approached and Christmas Day began, Marcus tucked Isabella into bed and returned to the living room to review the lecture notes he'd been preparing for his first semester of teaching. In a few weeks, he would stand in front of a classroom full of undergraduate students and share his love of mathematics with a new generation of learners. But tonight, sitting in his quiet apartment with the glow of Christmas lights reflecting off his laptop screen, Marcus Rodriguez simply felt grateful. Grateful for the daughter who had motivated every choice he'd made, for the professor who had recognized his potential, for the mathematics that had never really left him, and for the discovery that sometimes the most important journeys are the ones that lead us back to ourselves. 5 years later, Dr. Marcus Rodriguez stood at the Blackboard in MIT's largest lecture hall, delivering the annual Whitehead Lecture to an audience of over 400 mathematicians from around the world. The topic of his presentation was harmonic analysis in applied contexts, from custodial observations to theoretical breakthroughs, a deliberately provocative title that acknowledged his unconventional path to mathematical recognition. In the third row, 16-year-old Isabella Rodriguez sat next to Professor Chen, both of them following the complex mathematical arguments with ease. Isabella was now a sophomore at MIT, having been admitted early through a special program for exceptionally gifted students. She was double majoring in mathematics and computer science, with research interests that bridged theoretical analysis and machine learning applications. "The technique we're examining today," Marcus explained to his audience, "emerged from what might seem like an unlikely source, observations made during late-night custodial work in these very classrooms. It demonstrates that mathematical insight can arise anywhere at any time, when curious minds encounter patterns in need of explanation." The presentation chronicled not just Marcus's mathematical results, but the story of how those results had emerged from his unique perspective as someone who existed simultaneously inside and outside the academic world. His work had evolved far beyond those initial Blackboard conversations with Professor Chen, spawning an entire research program that now involved dozens of mathematicians across multiple institutions. But perhaps more significantly, Marcus's story had become a catalyst for broader changes in how the mathematical community thought about talent, opportunity, and inclusion. After his lecture, during the reception in MIT's faculty club, Marcus found himself surrounded by colleagues, students, and administrators eager to discuss both his research and his advocacy work. Over the past 5 years, he'd become one of the most prominent voices calling for mathematics departments to actively seek out and support unconventional talent. Your experience has changed how we recruit graduate students. Dr. Sarah Kim, now the department chair at MIT, told him during the reception, "We've started partnerships with community colleges, created bridge programs for students with non-traditional backgrounds, and established mentorship networks for mathematicians, balancing academic careers with family responsibilities." The initiatives Marcus had helped develop were producing remarkable results. 3 custodial staff members from various universities had been identified as having exceptional mathematical abilities and were now pursuing advanced degrees with full support from their institutions. A network of second-chance scholars, people who had left academia for various reasons and were finding pathways back, had grown to include over 200 mathematicians worldwide. "Dad," Isabella approached with Professor Chen, both of them carrying wine glasses and animated expressions. "Professor Chen was just telling me about the new paper she's working on based on our conversation last week about quantum harmonic oscillators." Marcus smiled at the easy way Isabella referred to cutting edge mathematical research as casual conversation. She'd grown up in academic environments, attending conferences and workshops, sitting in on graduate seminars when her schedule allowed. Her mathematical education had been anything but conventional, and she was thriving in ways that made Marcus proud and slightly terrified in equal measure. "Are you planning to pursue that line of research for your senior thesis?" Professor Chen asked Isabella. "Maybe," Isabella replied thoughtfully. "I'm also interested in the applications to cryptography that Dr. Martinez mentioned at the Security Symposium last month. There might be ways to combine the harmonic analysis techniques Dad developed with new approaches to quantum-resistant encryption, listening to his daughter discuss advanced research projects with the same enthusiasm she'd once brought to elementary school science fairs. Marcus felt the familiar mixture of wonder and disbelief that characterized much of his life since that pivotal night on Professor Chen's Blackboard. 10 years later, Rodriguez Institute for Mathematical Opportunity occupied an entire floor of Boston University's new Mathematics and Computer Science building. Marcus, now a full professor with an endowed chair, divided his time between research, teaching, and directing the Institute's programs for identifying and supporting mathematical talent in unexpected places. The Institute had become a model for similar programs at universities across the country. Its initiatives included partnerships with community organizations, online mentorship networks, and scholarship programs specifically designed for students with non-traditional backgrounds. The success stories that emerged from these programs had transformed conversations about diversity and inclusion in mathematical sciences. Isabella, now Dr. Isabella Rodriguez, at the age of 26, worked as a research scientist at a quantum and computing startup while maintaining a joint appointment as a visiting professor at MIT. Her doctoral dissertation had bridged her father's work in harmonic analysis with cutting-edge applications in quantum information theory, earning her recognition as one of the most promising young mathematicians of her generation. "The irony," she told a reporter for the AMS Notices during an interview about her career trajectory, "is that growing up with a father who initially hid his mathematical abilities taught me to look for brilliance in unexpected places. When I encounter a problem that seems impossible, I think about all the brilliant people who might have insights to share but haven't had the platform to voice them." The article, titled "From Custodial Work to Quantum Computing, the Rodriguez family's mathematical legacy," had sparked renewed interest in programs supporting non-traditional paths to mathematical careers. That same year, Marcus received the American Mathematical Society's Award for Distinguished Public Service, recognizing his contributions to expanding access to mathematical education and careers. The award ceremony took place during the joint mathematics meetings in Seattle, with Isabella delivering the introduction for her father's acceptance speech. "My father taught me that," Mathematics isn't about credentials or institutional affiliations, she told the audience of over 1,000 mathematicians. It's about curiosity, persistence, and the courage to pursue understanding, even when the path forward isn't clear. His work has shown that mathematical talent exists everywhere, and our job as a community is to create pathways for that talent to flourish. Marcus's acceptance speech focused on the importance of maintaining humility and curiosity throughout one's career. Regardless of professional success, 15 years ago, I was cleaning this community's blackboards, he said. Today, I have the privilege of writing on them as a colleague and collaborator. That transformation was possible because individuals like Professor Chen chose to see potential rather than circumstances, to invest in possibilities rather than probabilities. He paused, looking out at an audience that included many of the mathematicians who had shaped his career. But the most important lesson from my experience isn't about second chances or redemption narratives. It's about the mathematics itself. Mathematical truth doesn't care about your job title, your educational background, or your personal circumstances. It only cares about logical reasoning, creative insight, and the willingness to persist through difficult problems. Our community is strongest when we remember that brilliance can emerge from anywhere, at any time, in any form. 15 years later, Professor Marcus Rodriguez, now 54, sat in his office at Boston University reviewing applications for the Rodriguez Fellowship, a program that provided full funding for individuals with non-traditional backgrounds to pursue graduate studies in mathematics. This year's applicant pool included a former automotive mechanic who had discovered a passion for topology, a retired nurse whose statistical insights had revolutionized patient care protocols, and a single mother who had taught herself advanced calculus while working. Multiple jobs to support her family. Each application reminded Marcus of his own journey and reinforced his commitment to ensuring that mathematical opportunity wasn't limited by conventional pathways. His office walls were covered with photos, documenting the impact of the Institute's programs. Former custodians receiving PhD degrees, community college students presenting research at international conferences, working parents publishing papers in prestigious journals. The images told stories of transformation that went far beyond individual success. They represented a fundamental shift in how the mathematical community understood and nurtured talent. A knock on his door interrupted his review of applications. Isabella entered, now 31, and recently appointed as the youngest department chair in MIT's history. She was carrying a small box wrapped in silver paper. "Happy birthday, Dad," she said, setting the box on his desk. Marcus had forgotten it was his birthday, a common occurrence during fellowship application season. He unwrapped the box to find a piece of chalk mounted in a small display case, along with a plaque that read, "To the man who proved that mathematical truth transcends circumstances. Your daughter, who is grateful every day for the courage you showed in pursuing your dreams." "It's from Professor Chen's classroom," Isabella explained. "The same room where you first wrote on her blackboard. She saved the chalk you used that night and had it preserved for me to give you." Marcus stared at the simple piece of chalk, remembering the weight of it in his fingers on that night 20 years ago, when everything changed. The physical object was mundane, but it represented the moment when he'd chosen to reveal his hidden capabilities rather than continue hiding them. "There's something else," Isabella said, pulling out her phone to show him a video. This morning, a custodian at Stanford solved a graduate-level number theory problem that had been on Professor Williams's blackboard for 3 weeks. She wrote her solution anonymously, just like you did. But this time, instead of wondering about the mysterious contributor, Professor Williams immediately started investigating who on the custodial staff might have mathematical training. The video showed Professor Williams interviewing custodial workers with respect and curiosity, asking about their educational backgrounds and interests. The woman who had solved the problem, Maria Santos, a former high school mathematics teacher who had been forced to leave. Education due to immigration status issues was now being offered support to pursue graduate study while maintaining her employment. Your story changed how people think about these situations, Isabella continued. Now, when unexplained mathematical work appears, professors' first instinct is to find and support the person responsible rather than simply marvel at the mystery. Marcus watched the video with a mixture of pride, and 15 years later, Marcus watched the video with a mixture of pride and humility. The ripple effects of his story had traveled further than he'd ever imagined possible. What had begun as a desperate moment of mathematical expression on a late-night cleaning shift had evolved into a movement that was reshaping how the academic world identified and nurtured talent. There's more, Isabella said, scrolling to another video. This is from a conference in Barcelona last month. The video showed a panel discussion titled Hidden Brilliance, Recognizing Mathematical Talent in Unconventional Contexts. The panel included Maria Santos, who was now completing her PhD at Stanford, along with other mathematicians who had found their way back to academia through non-traditional paths. They were discussing the systemic changes needed to ensure that intellectual capability wasn't overlooked due to economic circumstances, educational gaps, or social barriers. Your father's story became a catalyst, one panelist was saying, but the real change has come from institutions recognizing that talent doesn't follow predictable patterns. We've had to fundamentally rethink how we identify, support, and develop mathematical potential. Marcus felt a deep satisfaction watching these discussions. The individual recognition he'd received for his mathematical work was meaningful, but seeing how his experience had contributed to broader systemic change felt like his most important legacy. A soft chime from his computer indicated an incoming video call. The screen showed Professor Chen, now nearing retirement, but still actively involved in research and mentorship. She was calling from her office at MIT, and Marcus could see the familiar Blackboard behind her, the same one where their collaboration had begun. Marcus, Isabella, Professor Chen said as the call connected. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important. Never, Marcus replied. We were just reviewing fellowship applications and discussing the Stanford situation. Oh yes, Maria Santos. Brilliant work on elliptic curves. She reminds me of another talented mathematician I once discovered working in custodial services. Professor Chen smiled, with the warmth that had characterized their relationship for 2 decades. Professor Chen, Isabella said, I wanted to thank you again for preserving that piece of chalk. Dad was quite moved by the gesture. It seemed appropriate. That chalk represents more than just a mathematical solution. It represents the moment when barriers between potential and opportunity began to dissolve. At least in our small corner of the academic world, Professor Chen's expression grew more serious. Actually, I'm calling because I have some news to share. The International Mathematical Union has announced this year's recipients of honorary fellowships, and Marcus, your name is on the list. Marcus felt his breath catch. The IMU's honorary fellowships were among the highest recognitions in mathematics, typically reserved for individuals whose contributions had fundamentally shaped the field over the course of their careers. The citation specifically mentions not only your research contributions, but your work in expanding access to mathematical careers. Professor Chen continued, you're being recognized for demonstrating that mathematical excellence can emerge from anywhere and for creating pathways for others to follow similar journeys. Isabella squeezed her father's shoulder, her own eyes bright with tears of pride. 20 years ago, Marcus had been afraid to let anyone see his mathematical capabilities. Now those capabilities, combined with his advocacy work, were being recognized at the highest international level. I don't know what to say, Marcus managed. Say you'll accept, Professor Chen replied with a laugh. The ceremony is in Rio de Janeiro this summer. I believe they'll want you to deliver a plenary lecture about mathematics, opportunity, and social responsibility. After the call ended, Marcus and Isabella sat in comfortable silence, processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. The honorary fellowship represented not just personal recognition, but validation of the idea that mathematical talent deserved support regardless of the circumstances in which it was discovered. "Dad," Isabella said finally, "or do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't written on that blackboard that night?" Marcus considered the question. "I think about it sometimes. I probably would have continued cleaning classrooms and tutoring students, finding small ways to stay connected to mathematics without ever fully embracing it again. But you did embrace it. Why that night? What made you decide to take the risk?" The question touched on something Marcus had never fully articulated, even to himself. "I think it was seeing your potential beginning to emerge. Watching you get excited about science and mathematics, knowing you were going to surpass anything I'd ever accomplished. I realized I couldn't model intellectual hiding for you. I couldn't teach you to diminish yourself to fit other people's expectations." Isabella nodded thoughtfully. "So, in a way, I was part of the reason you revealed your abilities. You were the reason I had the courage to stop hiding them," Marcus confirmed. "Everything I've accomplished since then has been motivated by wanting to show you that brilliance deserves recognition. The dreams deferred don't have to be dreams denied." 20 years later, the Marcus Rodriguez Mathematics Center at Boston University was bustling with activity on a crisp October morning. The center, which had grown from the original institute, now occupied an entire building and served as a model for similar programs at over 50 universities worldwide. Its mission had expanded beyond supporting non-traditional mathematical talent to include research into effective pedagogical approaches, policy advocacy for educational equity, and international collaboration on talent development initiatives. Marcus, now 59, had recently stepped down from his administrative duties to focus on research and mentorship. His office in the center was smaller than his previous administrative space, but filled with the things that mattered most to him: mathematical books, research papers, photos of students and colleagues, and the framed piece of chalk that had started it all. Today marked the 20th anniversary of the night he'd first written on Professor Chen's Blackboard, and the center was hosting a symposium to celebrate the progress that had been made in identifying and supporting mathematical talent. The event had drawn participants from around the world, including many individuals whose careers had been shaped by programs inspired by Marcus's story. The keynote address was being delivered by Dr. Maria Santos, who had become one of the leading researchers in algebraic number theory. Her presentation, titled "From Custodial Observations to Breakthrough: Theorems, 20 Years of Hidden Talent Revealed," chronicled the stories of dozens of mathematicians who had found their way to academic careers through unconventional paths. The Rodriguez model, Dr. Santos explained to the audience, isn't just about second chances or redemption narratives. It's about recognizing that mathematical talent exists in every community, at every social level, in every profession. Our job as educators and researchers is to create systems that can identify and nurture that talent, regardless of where it appears. Marcus listened from the audience, sitting next to Isabella, who was now 36 and serving as the director of MIT's Quantum Computing Research Center. Her own career had been shaped by the lessons of her father's journey. She'd learned early that brilliance needed to be coupled with persistence, humility, and a commitment to lifting others as you climbed. During the lunch break, Marcus found himself in conversation with a group of graduate students who were participating in the center's current programs. One young woman, Sarah Kim, the third Sarah Kim Marcus had encountered in his mathematical career, was completing her PhD while working as a translator to support her family. Another student, David Martinez, had discovered his passion for topology while serving in the military and was now pursuing advanced study with full fellowship support. "Professor Rodriguez," Sarah asked, What advice would you give to someone who feels like they're starting their mathematical career later than their peers? Marcus thought about the question, remembering his own fears and insecurities during his transition back to academic life. Mathematics doesn't have a timeline, he said finally. Some people discover their abilities at 5 years old, others at 50. What matters isn't when you start, but how committed you are to the journey once you begin. But don't you sometimes feel like you lost important years? David pressed. Don't you wonder how much further you might have gone if circumstances had been different? The question echoed thoughts Marcus had wrestled with for years. I used to think about that, he admitted. I used to calculate how many papers I might have published, how many conferences I might have attended, how much deeper into my research I might have gone if I'd never left academia. He paused, looking around the room at the students, researchers, and advocates who had gathered to celebrate 2 decades of progress in expanding mathematical opportunity. But then I realized I was asking the wrong question. Instead of wondering what I might have accomplished if my path had been different, I should be grateful for what I was able to accomplish, because my path was different. The perspective I gained from working outside academia, the empathy I developed for non-traditional students, the advocacy work that emerged from my own struggles, none of that would have existed if I'd followed a conventional career trajectory. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. So you're saying that the detour wasn't actually a detour? I'm saying that sometimes what looks like a detour is actually the route you were supposed to take all along. The mathematics I do now is informed by every experience I've had, including and especially the years when I thought I'd lost mathematics forever. That evening, the symposium concluded with a panel discussion featuring Marcus, Professor Chen, now Professor Emeritus but still sharp and engaged, Isabella, and several other mathematicians whose careers had been shaped by programs supporting non-traditional paths to academia. The moderator, Dr. Jennifer Williams from the National Science Foundation, asked the panel to reflect on the changes they'd witnessed over the past 2 decades. When Marcus first wrote on my Blackboard, Professor Chen said, I was primarily thinking about solving a mathematical problem. I had no idea we were beginning a conversation that would eventually reshape how our community thinks about talent identification and development. The systemic changes have been remarkable, Isabella added. 20 years ago, universities had rigid pathways for mathematical careers. Today, there are bridge programs, flexible degree options, family support services, and mentorship networks specifically designed to help people with non-traditional backgrounds succeed in academia. Marcus found himself thinking about the broader implications of their work. What strikes me most, he said, is how this experience has taught us that diversity isn't just a moral imperative, it's an intellectual necessity. The mathematical community is stronger when it includes voices from different backgrounds, different life experiences, different perspectives on problem solving. The discussion continued for over an hour, touching on everything from policy recommendations to funding strategies to the ongoing work needed to ensure that mathematical opportunity remained accessible to all. As the evening drew to a close, Dr. Williams asked each panelist to share their hopes for the next 20 years. I hope we reach a point where stories like Marcus's aren't remarkable because they're unusual, Professor Chen said. I hope they become unremarkable because they're common, because we've created systems that routinely identify and support mathematical talent wherever it appears. Isabella expressed hope for continued technological innovation that could make mathematical education and research more accessible to people with diverse needs and circumstances. Other panelists discussed the importance of international collaboration and the potential for expanding support programs beyond mathematics to other STEM fields. When it was Marcus's turn to speak, he thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment, from that first night of chalk dust and mathematical revelation to this celebration of systemic change and expanded opportunity. My hope, he said, is that 20 years from now, we're having this conversation not about the obstacles we've overcome, but about the discoveries we've made. I hope we're celebrating not just the people we've helped enter mathematics, but the mathematical breakthroughs they've achieved once they got here. He paused, looking out at an audience that included former custodians who were now professors, single parents who had become researchers, immigrants who had found new careers through mathematical talent, and young people who were just beginning their own journeys in the field. Mathematics has the power to transform individual lives, but it also has the power to transform our understanding of the universe. When we expand access to mathematical careers, we're not just helping individuals, we're increasing the likelihood that the next great breakthrough, the next revolutionary insight, the next paradigm-shifting discovery will come from someone whose potential might otherwise have been overlooked. As the symposium ended and participants began to disperse, Marcus found himself alone in the auditorium where the day's events had taken place. The room was quiet now, but it had been filled with energy, ideas, and hope for the future of mathematical education and research. His phone buzzed with a text from Isabella. "Dad, I'm proud of you not just for what you've accomplished, but for how you've used your success to create opportunities for others. See you at home." Marcus smiled and gathered his papers, preparing to leave the building that bore his name, but represented the work of countless individuals who had contributed to expanding mathematical opportunity. As he walked through the corridors, lined with photos documenting 20 years of progress, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The scared custodian who had trembled while writing on Professor Chen's Blackboard could never have imagined this outcome. That man had been focused simply on expressing mathematical ideas that had been trapped inside him for too long. He had no vision of systemic change, no plan for advocacy work, no dream of international recognition, but sometimes, Marcus reflected, the most important journeys begin with a single step taken, not because you can see the destination, but because staying where you are is no longer possible. 20 years ago, he had needed to write mathematics on that blackboard the way he had needed to breathe. Everything that followed, the research, the teaching, the advocacy, the policy work, the international recognition, had grown naturally from that one moment of authentic expression. As he stepped outside into the cool October evening, Marcus looked up at the stars visible above the city lights. Somewhere out there were patterns waiting to be discovered, mathematical relationships that could transform human understanding of the universe. And somewhere down here were brilliant minds, working in hospitals and restaurants, driving trucks and cleaning buildings, raising children and caring for parents, whose insights could unlock those cosmic secrets. If only they were given the chance. The work was far from finished. There were still barriers to break down, systems to reform, opportunities to create. But 20 years of progress had proven that change was possible, that talent could be nurtured regardless of circumstances, and that the mathematical community was capable of transformation. Marcus Rodriguez, Professor Emeritus, father, advocate, and mathematician, walked toward his car with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had found his way back to himself and then used that discovery to help others find their own paths to brilliance. The piece of chalk in his office represented the beginning of a journey, but the journey itself was still unfolding, still creating opportunities for hidden talent to emerge into the light where it belonged. Thank you for following Marcus and Isabella's inspiring journey. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel for more uplifting tales of human potential, and subscribe to support our efforts in bringing these meaningful stories to life. Behind him, the Marcus Rodriguez Mathematics Center stood as a monument not to individual achievement, but to collective possibility. Proof that when barriers to intellectual opportunity are removed, human potential knows no bounds. This story celebrates the power of hidden talent, the importance of second chances, and the transformative impact that occurs when society creates pathways for brilliance to emerge from unexpected places. It reminds us that mathematical genius and human potential in general exists everywhere, waiting for the right moment and the right support to change the world.